Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. I'm again joined by Swithun Dobson, Terminal Philosophy, and Keith Preston. We're here to discuss the nature of understanding history. So, growing up, I would get a lot of discount used history books, and a lot of them were published, between like 1950 and 1990. And they tended to emphasize the methodology of interpreting history as a series of revolutions, whether it's revolutions in thought, military revolutions, or political revolutions. And that was what I just sort of thought, that's how everybody does history, right? You just have this revolutionary framework of looking at these big points in history where things change radically. And as I got to college and started reading more, up to date books, there was this drive towards, oh, it's all the same. It's this gradual change over time. Revolutions are just not real and yada, 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 all of this stuff. And I mean, some of the worst examples would be like, well, the ancient Hebrews were just like the Babylonians and the Canaanites. What they had in common was far out number what they had in difference, which, I mean, that's patently absurd on so many levels. And this kind of interpretation of gradualism, I mean, if you parodied it, you'd have people that said, the Russian Revolution didn't happen because all the political structures were still more or less the same before and after 1917. And so, just the similarities of Russia from 1916 to 1918 are so great that any difference doesn't really matter. The other thing that they tend to do is if somebody makes a claim for a revolutionary moment in history, like say the Reformation, they'll nitpick a particular position on that, saying that it overstates the case. Because the case is overstated, therefore it's not a revolution at all. Or maybe somebody doesn't properly ground the origin point of this revolutionary moment. And they'll be like, well, it did come from these pre-existing structures. And so because it comes from pre-existing structures, it's really not discontinuous at all. And so they tend to go with, there's no discontinuity because it's already developing from pre-existing structures. And then nitpicking the people who maybe overstate the case. But what I'd like to say is that if you just look at that, it's a patently absurd thing to say. I mean, if you look at Europe before 1517, are there precursors of the Reformation? Yes. Through the Lollards, the Hussites, the Waldensians, all of whom are precursors to the Reformation. But after 1517, with Luther and the 95 Theses, one thing happened for sure. The unity of Western Christendom under the control of the Catholic Church was fatally broken forever. And so it's nothing like the medieval consensus before then. And to argue that that's not a revolutionary moment or that you can just somehow water it down and emphasize continuity is just really ridiculous. Terminal philosophy, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, this is a very interesting question because it sits somewhere in the nexus of history, philosophy, and probably psychology to an extent. My short answer is that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Between highly consequential figures like Napoleon or Hitler and the sort of monotony of everyday life for people all over the world for millennia. I think between those two ends of the spectrum is probably somewhere in the middle, although I will say I tend to put a bit more credit to the revolutionary interpretation of history because pivotal moments like the overthrow of a monarch or some sort of breakthrough in technology tends to be more self-evidently consequential than, say, slowly compounding events of, tedious everyday life. When I was studying philosophy in college, Hegel was sort of at the center of my interest because of his work called The Philosophy of History. And I assume everyone here has read either some Hegel or is at least familiar with Hegelian dialectics and the process of thesis to antithesis and finally synthesis. I think that this sort of concentrated effort of putting some sort of philosophical framework in the interpretation of history tends to favor this sort of revolutionary interpretation of history that you had mentioned earlier. I think, if we were to trace the sort of intellectual history of this dichotomy between revolutionary interpretations or gradualist interpretations, I think you have people like you probably have people like Hegel on one end, and there's probably other names, of course, you could put in that category. And on the other end, you have more modern examples of people, say, like Howard Zinn, and you have interpretations like, the People's History of the United States, or I forget who wrote the People's History of the World, sort of the Bertolt Brechts of the world, who are they have more of a concentration on the masses. And I think that this is in part a reaction to sort of your more, if you can colloquially call it, the old school interpretation of history, where, because so much work has been done in that mode of thinking, I think post, 1960s social revolution onward, there's been this sort of quasi-Marxist, quasi-socialistic focus on the sort of the masses of society and how those and how that component affects history. But I think that without events like the French Revolution, or without figures like Mao or Pol Pot or Napoleon and so on and so forth, you wouldn't have these breakthroughs in history. I mean, it's just difficult to imagine that, if it was a world of just like, if everyone were more, I don't know how else to put this, but if everyone were more similar in the sense that everyone were a working class person and didn't have some ambitious plan for history, no matter how poorly thought out or bloody it might be, well, then you would see a more gradualist, drive for, progress and material improvement and things like that. But because, there's all sorts of different personalities out there. I mean, you've got people like, real revolutionaries, people like Che Guevara and things like that in the early Soviet revolutionaries who, even if their vision was flawed, or even if it, ended up being incredibly bloody, at least they were following something to its end. And, I guess the last thing I'll say is that, sometimes, no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, people often think that, it's this one particular group or it's that group that's running the show. It's like, it's the Illuminati, or it's, it's the Freemasons or something like that. And I think the answer, I think it's something more drab and slightly more uninteresting. It's just that a lot of our leaders probably are actually as incompetent as they seem to be, because, people like Gorbachev, they were scraping against the barrel trying to retain the Soviet Union as long as possible, but they knew things were coming to an end, but they were still sticking to it. And, another example of this is like, Hitler ordering invisible divisions to break the siege of Berlin, when, he was just following this into the ground because, he just saw this as his way, and, rather than being some sort of top down thing. So to relate that back to the historiography of, of revolutionary interpretations versus gradualist, I think there's better works of history that support the revolutionary interpretation, because I see the gradualist interpretation as something that's more reactionary against, I guess, what we'll loosely call the old school revolutionary interpretation of history.
All right, Keith.
Well, I actually studied history at the graduate level, and I got a pretty good overview of how contemporary historians tend to approach the study of history. One of the first classes you'll take in a graduate history program is historiography. And then you go over all the different paradigms that are used as a mode of historical interpretation. And the ones that tend to be the most influential today are really three. There's the Marxist view, which is historical materialism. It sees everything in terms of class struggles and revolutions and things like that. And I suspect that the reason most history books from the mid 50s through the 1990s emphasized revolutions and all of that is because that's probably when the Marxist view of historical studies was at its peak. And then you also have the Weberian view, the view of Max Weber, which is sort of a counter-Marxist view, which is that, well, it's not just about class, it's not just about material interests. There's other systems of power, there's other forces in history, there's ideas, there's culture, there's religion, there's philosophy. So it's sort of an idealist counterpart to Marxism. And then the third one is what's called the Annales School, and that was developed by some French historians in the mid 20th century. But it's basically the paradigm from which we get social history. And social history, I would say, is the dominant paradigm today. So implicitly influenced by the Annales School, even by people who don't claim to be of the Annales School. And I think that's why, as Todd pointed out, now you've got this emphasis on gradual change, because the social history is based on the bottom-up study of history. They will argue that, well, real social change comes from the bottom up, and it happens gradually. What we were always told when I was in graduate school is that in the ancient, they would say, well, in the old times, in the Dark Ages, they would emphasize the great man theory of history. That is, you'd have some great man that appears on the historical stage and shapes history, like whether it's, in the history of religion, it would be Socrates or Lao Tzu or Jesus or Muhammad, or whether in world political history it would be Julius Caesar or Napoleon or somebody like that. And they would say, well, that's wrong. It's not just one man that shapes history. They would say it's more it all comes from the bottom up, and they do it all by the standard race, class, gender paradigm. Like what made the American Revolution wasn't George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and their importation of European Enlightenment ideas to North America, or their interest in Greek philosophy. No, it was actually poor farmers and it was a bottom up revolution. That's the kind of point of view that they put on. So that I think is why you get the view of history today, that history is a series of gradual, kind of micro level changes. It's because they're trying to do it from this kind of bottom up perspective, this kind of social history perspective, which in a way de-emphasizes, either the great man theory, and to take that approach, you really sort of have to de-emphasize the revolutionary paradigm as well, because the Marxist paradigm is that you basically have these. It's almost like the Marxist paradigm is kind of like to history what Stephen Gould's theory of punctuated equilibrium is to evolutionary biology, which is the idea that we have these periods, these long periods where basically nothing happens, and then you have these calamitous, very short periods, and then you'll have another long period of nothing. And that's kind of how the emphasis on history that's based on this kind of revolutionary paradigm works. It's kind of how the Marxist view works. In fact, it was either Marx himself or maybe Lenin or one of them who said that, well, in history, 10 minutes is often more important than 100 years or something like that. So that's kind of where the historical field is today. Nowadays, historians tend to place a lot of emphasis on social history, on bottom-up history, the role of the forgotten people of history. What were the slaves doing during the American Revolution, and what were women doing in the French Revolution, and all these kinds of things. And they'll argue, the argument is, well, it was all of this that made the revolution. Let's say a nanny that killed her aristocratic master or something, she was just as important to the revolution as Robespierre or whomever. So that's I think why we have the kind of paradigm now that Todd is describing, because of this influence on the influence of social history, which is derived from this kind of a Annales School perspective that emerged in the mid 20th century, which has actually superseded Marxism.
Yeah, Swithun.
It seems to me that the this approach to history is very much sort of consistent with what is largely like a social determinist view of reality, in that well, it's just these external forces. No one really has any individual agency of any description. We're merely just a result of our environment. And so what we need to do is we then apply this to history. We go, well, just all these other forces, all these other things that are taking place, and over time, that we just end up with these changes that we end up having. I mean, interesting. I'm not sure how they go with it. I mean, you can't. It might end. I wonder to what extent it kind of has some sort of telos. Have all these general forces at play, which sort of always incremental changes. The question is, well, what's sort of driving those changes specifically? If it's just so sort of inert and sort of gradual. So it would seem to me to be consistent with the underplaying of sort of the great man and the individual who sort of rises above his society and makes his mark on it, which is somewhat ironic, I think, because I wouldn't be surprised if most of the historians who peddle the idea of these gradual changes will have seen Donald Trump as some sort of great evil, this great guy who is somehow these Machiavellian powers got to this great position of presidents, and he's going to try and usurp the republic or something like that. I would not be surprised in any way, shape, or form if anybody attempted that kind of analysis and happened to hold that sort of historical view. So as TP pointed out, it is the question of continuity and discontinuity. And it seems obvious there is continuity in history and there's discontinuity. Of course, there's precursors, as Todd, as you said, with the Waldensians, etc. But no, it was Luther who was the figure who really broke the Roman Catholic Church monopoly in the west of Europe. And I suppose you could add in Henry VIII there as well to get rid of one of the major countries having a state church, which wasn't part of the Roman Catholic Church. These are clearly huge events. When you were talking about this before, it made me think of something completely unpolitical with respect to history, but I thought it may be relevant, which sounds really lame, but is the history of football tactics. Now, the reason I mention this bizarre thing, now this is soccer for the Americans, is that nobody, if you talk about the history of football tactics, will deny that there's any genuine innovators or approaching sport in general. They will point to particular figures, particular coaches who made a very big difference to the way football is played. So today I was about Pep Guardiola. And one that came to mind particularly was in the 1970s, Rinus Michels, who was the coach of the Dutch side in the 1974 World Cup, which brought what was called total football. Now, prior to this, people had generally played in relatively rigid positions on the pitch. If you play on the left side of the pitch, that's basically where you stayed, within some freedom, but not huge amounts. The Dutch side of 74, lots of the players just moved everywhere, which was a very big change. And this is recognized as, obviously there's precursors, but there was clearly discontinuity. And imagine, I can't think of any, another one, is it in film history? Is it On the Waterfront, which is used as the example of creating modern cinema as moving away from theatrical acting to moving to sort of genuine cinematic acting with Marlon Brando, I think is generally cited. So it's interesting if you look at history of specific areas which are outside of politics, in a sense, the historiographies are not self-conscious, and they clearly recognize continuity and discontinuity in a relatively, now obviously there's disputes over certain aspects, but no one would deny that there are particularly important figures who change the way things are done. So it seems odd, I think, that when you have these relatively one areas more about because they're over such a shorter period of time, and you can clearly see the changes over time and the discontinuities, that then when you take an area in a sense less about, at least relative to the amount of information that was possibly available for that, then you come to this weird gradualist thing, because no one would take you seriously to talk about a general gradualist theory in the change of the history of film or of sport. I mean, you'd just be nonsensical.
Mm-hmm.
So that was just, I thought was an interesting comparison.
Yeah, I think I just want to give an example, how this has changed, and why I think this methodology is just so bad. So I think this was certainly popular with the English historian Charles Oman, who I think died like in 1950 and wrote a lot about medieval warfare, and it was the idea of the cavalry revolution. So in the Battle of Adrianople in 378, the Roman legion had reigned supreme for almost 1,000 years. And, Gothic lancers upset that status quo permanently, which led rise to the medieval knight in Western Europe and, similar formations in the East, the cataphracti. And that for about 1,000 years until Cressy, with the English revolutionized warfare into the infantry revolution, which culminated in the age of pike and shot and the relegating of cavalry to a secondary role. That's the infantry. Those are the two revolutions of that 1,000-year period. And what'll happen today is the evolutionary model will be like, well, you see, actually, infantry were always used in the Middle Ages. But yeah, that's not really the point. Whether it's Hastings or Mainz occurred or some other battle, it's the horses that deliver the knockout blow. They're the decisive element, not the infantry. No one ever said that infantry. See, that's the thing. They misstate their opponent's position. Nobody ever said infantry wasn't being used. Infantry was in a subsidiary support role, which that role changes after the infantry revolution, where then cavalry is in a subsidiary support role. Or they'll point to things like, well, cavalry really weren't that much more effective than before. And, all of these, hemming and hawing and nitpicking. And this stuff is just extremely dishonest. Like, we all know that Hastings was a smashing victory for the Normans because of their knights. The reason why, the Scots were ground into the dust, and even the Welsh by Edward I, was because of his knights. I mean, that was just the decisive element for a very long time. And they'll play these games, or like, Keith was saying, the Nail school with the unknown people. Well, I mean, that's just basically a carte blanche to make things up. That's also why you have a lot of people that want to do history before civilization. They want to analyze, like, I don't know, the Basque people from 10,000 BC. It's like, you don't know anything about these people. You can't know anything about these people. You just pick them because there's so little evidence that it's like 2% actual hard evidence and 98% speculation. And you can just basically, you're basically DMing a Dungeons and Dragons game and getting paid to do it, and then printing articles as if it's real study. Like, it's really just that bad. And that's where you get all these crazy ideas from. See, that's why we don't do real history anymore. So we don't talk about the French Revolution or, the Reformation or, legions and phalanxes or, Socrates and Kant. It's because there's too much written account, right? The written record is a disciplining force in the life of a historian. The historian has to, whatever his assumptions may or may not be, whatever interpretive method he's using, he still has to limit himself by the access to written material. It's not like writing a fantasy novel where you can just write whatever you want. But if you study areas that don't have a lot of written records, i.e., illiterate masses of the population, or before civilization, then it becomes a lot more like science fiction and fantasy. You just make stuff up. And I mean, we see the worst example of that with Margaret Mead, in her work on Samoa, where it turns out that the Samoans just literally just made stuff up and just told her whatever she wanted to hear, when someone actually bothered to recapitulate her studies 40, 50 years later. And those are with people that you can talk to. Just imagine someone with, the mendacity of Margaret Mead talking about people that are already dead. And we just have a few, stone arrowheads to know they even existed. Terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, I think I agree with virtually all of that. I just continuing with my initial comments. I should clarify that when I say that I tend to lean towards the so-called revolutionary interpretation of history, I don't mean Marxism per se, although I do agree that Marx was right about the fall of early 20th century capitalism, a la the Great Depression. This is something that Keith has pointed out in several videos. But what I really mean is that history and sort of in the loosest sense, the progress of humanity seems utterly dependent on these pivotal moments of moments like revolutions or wars or famous battles or breakthroughs in technology or some type of innovation in economics or modes of production, because otherwise, you have the masses that carry out these new sort of breakthroughs in history, but it requires the breakthrough in the first place. And so, to your point about, I think it's really funny about, Margaret Mead and how she's still revered in, modern archaeology is this, this brilliant scholar. And, there's all sorts of other individuals like her in the humanities. But I have noticed that, I think you guys would probably agree that modern academics, particularly in the humanities, have taken a strong liking to obscure topics and obscure people throughout history because, I think it is it is fascinating to think about, the people, 5,000 BC, but, there's no written records of them. So I think because there's so little written on them, I think a lot of these academics take it upon themselves to at least professionally speculate on their impact in history. Now, it's not that there's anything wrong with that per se, but that it's that they tend to inflate the historical impact of a lot of these people. And that's sort of the problem there. I don't think there's anything wrong with speculating, about ancient peoples or even or any peoples throughout history that, there's very little known about. But, and this probably exists somewhere between the overlap between archaeology and history, which I think is actually very interesting. But I think the unfortunate tendency of modern academics is to sort of inflate the historical impact of these people. And, Swithun talked earlier about, Donald Trump. And I can't remember who said this. I think it was probably Slavoj Žižek or something like that. But one interpretation of Donald Trump that I found actually quite accurate, I do believe it was him, is that, Donald Trump is more or less the ultimate postmodern political figure in recent history, because you just get to project whatever you want on him. He's either, the reincarnation of Heinrich Himmler, or, he's saving the republic in this sort of Reagan-esque type of figure, or he's just another suit, for the apolitical normie. He's just sort of this fascinating blank canvas that you get to just project whatever you want on him. So regardless of whatever you think of Donald Trump or Ronald Reagan or any president or figure for that matter, it's that history requires these figures in general to motivate the masses into some sort of direction. When you read Howard Zinn, for example, which Keith, you're free to disagree with this, but he seems to fall somewhere in between the Marxist and the Annal school of interpretation. But a lot of his, the People's History of the United States is sort of this scathing overview of the United States, as not a force for good, but really this repressive sort of force of evil. That's not what he doesn't say that outright, but it's certainly sometimes you kind of get glimpses of that in the subtext. And so I wouldn't say that all historians who take it upon this effort upon themselves to write history in the Marxist or the Annal school, I wouldn't say they're all cynical, but it sure has that atmosphere to it. And so, because I think we've had this long tradition of recording history based off of great events, and so whether it's out of spite or something like that, it's just unfortunately there's a bit of depression in modern academia because there's such an extreme focus on the lesser known peoples. And while we're not talking about things like Shakespeare as probably often as we should, or the ancient Greeks or Herodotus and figures like that.
All right, Keith.
Yeah, one thing you'll find in the academy today when it comes to the study of history is you see it's almost like it's an inversion of what you would have gotten, say, maybe 100 years ago in terms of historical studies, maybe even more recently than that. But for instance, at one point in the study of history, there was not only a great emphasis on personalities, but there was also a great emphasis on intellectual history, the history of ideas. There was also a big emphasis on military history. Nowadays, you'd be very hard pressed to find an academic history department anywhere that had any classes on military history. I mean, they may talk about military matters as sort of a side run to, like say Latin American history, where you'll talk about the Mexican Revolution or something like that. So they'll bring that in as sort of a side thing. But say the role of say military commanders and all of that in the conduction of war and how that has shaped say civilizations, that's something that would be left out of the curriculum entirely. Intellectual history even is not very widely used. Two of the best courses I actually had in graduate school were one was on modern European intellectual history and one was on Weimar intellectual culture, and they were both taught by a fellow who was he was definitely a liberal. He would describe himself as a liberal in the school of The Nation magazine. That's how he actually described himself to me once. So, but he was also associated with telos and publications like that. But he was actually very disdainful of the fact that a lot of modern history ignores intellectual history and military history and some of these other disciplines. In fact, there was a conflict in the faculty between him and another fellow they were sort of like co-chairman of the department, and the other fellow was a Marxist who was from one of the Caribbean islands, I think Antigua. And he was very into the sort of neo-Marxist Frantz Fanon, wretched of the earth type of paradigm. That was his kind of outlook. And he was very big on diversifying curriculum and that kind of stuff. And he wanted to hire more professors from, who were Muslim in their background or something like that. And the other fellow thought he was doing this at the expense of academic rigor. That was an issue that was going on. I had another professor once who this was actually my historiographer professor, who said that he said real historians don't do biographies, and what he meant by that is like you shouldn't have an approach to history that emphasizes individuals. It should all be about processes. He was also very heavily influenced by postmodernism. Like he used to say, human nature does not exist. That kind. He was very emphatic about that. So yeah, you have these are the sort of the paradigms that you see floating in the field of history now. You have some more mid 20th century type of perspectives, but then you have these postmodern and neo-Marxist and neo-school social history perspectives as well. But you would also find classes in the history department that were frankly kind of a joke. Like you had, there was one on women in colonial American, and I never signed up for it because I didn't think I could bear to inflict that on myself. But a friend of mine took that class, and he said, yeah, basically it was all talking about like, styles of embroidery and stuff, like stuff women would have been doing in 1600s Americas with like just clothing styles and all that kind of stuff, and then some medical stuff, like death during childbirth and all the problems you had in the early modern societies. Yeah, so it's like this is similar to what terminal philosophy was saying about how, well, if they can't really get the social history they want, they just make it up because they think they've got to have this kind of cool social history perspective. Well, we got to remember all the forgotten people. Well, maybe they're forgotten for a reason. Maybe they didn't actually do anything. And so but somehow we've got to bring them back and give them their voice in history. As far as Howard Zinn, I remember reading Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. I read it when I was probably I was in my early 20s. And the way I was taught history in elementary school was, I went to a very conservative private school, so I got kind of the view of American history you would have gotten in a 1950s public school, which is basically, America's God's country, and we never did anything wrong, except that Civil War thing was kind of bad because Americans killed other Americans. But other than that, we've gotten it back together since then. And I remember thinking, well, this is sort of like taking this kind of 1950s model of American history and flipping it on its head, but one thing I do give Zen credit for is that in the edition of that book that I had, in the intro part, he actually starts off by saying, yes, this book is biased and deliberately so. So I remember reading it and thinking, okay, I'm glad he admits to that this is not an objective narrative he's trying to tell here. This is, ideological. He's trying to create his own paradigm. But the Howard Zinn book, though, is so one-sided, it's almost funny. Like there's this one part of People's History of the United States where he talks about the American ship that was captured by the Khmer Rouge towards the end of the Vietnam War. I think the war may have actually ended, but there was a situation where there was an American ship that was captured by the Khmer Rouge in 1975. And it talks about how what nice guys these Cambodians were that came aboard the ship to greet the Americans that they captured, which the Khmer Rouge did actually let the ship go because obviously out of self-preservation they didn't want to get into another direct conflict with the United States over a ship. But I remember thinking at the time, this is ridiculous. I mean, this is just one-sided nonsense. But even if bits and pieces of that book are interesting, but yeah, it's so that's kind of where that's kind of the biases that are built into the field now. There's this pathological rejection of the great man theory of history. There's this pathological fixation on this kind of bottom-up history. Like what did the indentured servants do? That's how indentured servants are really the ones who made civilization what it is.
All right, Swithun.
I think as is probably clear, I think this is largely, as we mentioned so far, so politically driven. As Keith was saying, what did the indentured servants do? I mean, it's pretty clear in any society that you always have leaders in society, even if it's like an anarchist community. You're going to have people who create trends and people who are followed to some extent. Because people recognize their better superiority at doing certain things, certain abilities. And so it seems to be pretty darn obvious that whatever a leader in a particular social group thinks or does is going to make an impact on everybody else. And the impact is, in a sense, in that way, is going to be top down. Now, obviously, it's bottom up insofar as, oh yes, but the upbringing and the childhood and the environment, which, well, obviously, of course. But again, this comes back to to what extent do humans themselves have agency, as I mentioned before. As Keith mentioned, one of the historians he was taught by is like human nature does not exist. There's no sort of human that is acting, as it were. Mises would be upset at this point. So it's I think what happens with this view is effectively that man ceases to be sort of like a rational actor in history and is sort of like just pushed along, which is why I think intellectual history is sort of like being downplayed, because ideas, as it were, don't particularly matter, because, well, ideas are merely just power plays. I suppose this is going all the Foucaultian approach. Who is very culturally influential in certain respects. Now, to what extent his direct impact on history is, I don't know. But it's ideas as ideas are sort of ignored. Even though if you look at, I mean, you and Keith did a while ago, Todd, was a major, the sociology of history, the major determinants of it was basically geography, culture, and biology. And it's like, well, I'm pretty sure ideas is pretty high up on the sort of general view of what's going to determine what happens, because what people think is true and what drives them and their goals is going to determine what they spend their time doing, which of course is going to determine what happens. Link this into, well, let's put it this way. If most people haven't realized that most people are sheep, you have obviously been living under a rock for the last 18 months. Most people just follow what people who are in authority tell them to do. Are you saying that these people in authority have made no difference on history? If it was the case that Xi Jinping had decided not to lock down China, that everyone else would have followed, I don't think so. I mean, it's possible, but I think it's somewhat less likely. Certainly, if none of the major European countries would have done it, the Africans would have followed, because that wouldn't have been driven by the WHO or these other things. So whatever they decide to do makes a difference. Now, of course, you can say, well, they're run by large bureaucracies, and it's a natural progression of it's a natural progression of sort of like the modern bureaucratic state to extend its power, and this is the inbuilt nature of it, and the incentives built up there, etc. Something along those lines. But there's some individuals there who have to decide what to do, and some states, which are modern Western ones, didn't, such as Sweden. So it's obvious that individual decisions make a difference, and this is going to be determined largely, or you could say in total, depending how narrowly or broadly you want to define it, by ideas. And so, again, I think that the general sort of postmodern impact on this has really been to downplay the importance of ideas, that people are just somewhat irrational and are sort of just do what they feel is right. Well, no, it's right, just they do it. And there's no real sort of idea or anything that's guiding it. And so it's sort of like just a big blob. Except, of course, there's the evil people controlling it who are oppressing everybody. Again, I think, yeah, it's sort of like the postmodern approach is sort of downplaying the role of ideas, because they don't think ideas have any value apart from sort of being part of the oppressor class on the oppressed.
So we're nearing the end, so I'll start with some of my closing statements. What a lot of this boils down to as well is the idea that there is no meaning, there's no truth out there at all, and that we can just make stuff up as we go along. Classic example of this is a statement by Elie Weiss, who wrote Night, after about meeting his childhood rabbi years after publishing the work. And his rabbi asks him what he does. He goes through what he does. He writes books about things that might have happened to people that might have existed, blah, 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 blah. And the rabbi's like, well, then you're lying, right? And he gets all defensive. And then, but that's the point, right? History is a weapon for these people. We had a video a few months ago, History is a Weapon. Truth isn't out there, or rather, if it is out there, it's irrelevant, right? It's just what we make it to be. And so there is this intentional mendacity with people today that do history, that teach history, that just didn't really exist before. I mean, yeah, were there some people that lied about certain things? Sure. But there was still this overall framework of, this is the goal of the historian, is to determine or understand the truth of the events as best as he can. Again, it doesn't mean there's a few bad apples that would lie for a cause or an individual or whatever. But now the script has been flipped. The goal of the historian is to lie compulsively all of the time for his agenda. And I really do think in that regards, Night was instrumental, because it just normalized this idea that you can just literally make stuff up and call it history, and we'll run with it. Terminal philosophy.
Right. Well, yeah, this has been an interesting conversation. I guess just some initial thoughts about what Swithun and Keith had mentioned earlier. I think it's fair to say that, based off this conversation, that classically educated people are slowly, unfortunately, becoming a thing of the past. And by which I mean is that the generation of World War I and World War II, and kind of that first quarter or first half of the 20th century, a lot of those populations tend to be, I guess, this kind of is being a little bit more specific to the Anglosphere, for better or for worse, but those populations tended to be more well versed in things like Shakespeare and Homer, and may have been exposed to maybe a little bit of Latin or maybe a little bit of Greek and things like that. Maybe not to these high academic levels, but there was more breadth and depth exposure to these sort of classical education topics. And Todd and I were speaking earlier after we finished today's latest episode of the History of Warfare series, which we're doing, which maybe we'll finish by the time we're in our 90s. But we were talking after today's episode, and one thing that we sort of agreed on was that we were talking about how poorly public education covers the history of warfare, and to a lesser extent, the history of ideas, or what's known as intellectual history. And that, we've had to go research things on our own, like, with the topic like the Civil War. I had to go find out for myself that, the war wasn't just exclusively about slavery. It actually was, there's a strong case to be made that the Civil War was highly motivated by tariffs that were imposed from the North to the Confederate States. And so, and you have to go find this information out for yourself. If you just go along with the current, like the modern day public education curriculum, unfortunately, you're left with this huge deficit of knowledge that a lot of people had, not that long ago, just in the earlier part of the 20th century. Keith, you had talked about some of the things you had read in graduate school. And I think, just speaking for myself, when I was studying philosophy in undergraduate, or as an undergraduate, I remember reading 2 volumes of Frederick Copleston's A History of Philosophy. And that whole series, in my opinion, is it's one of the greatest works of historiography, and as far as the modern world goes, because it's just so rigorous, and it's also very accessible. It's much more easy to understand. Whereas, like, if you pick up a book from Foucault or something like that, it's you're going to be exercising yourself neurologically to understand certain things. So, just in closing, I'll say that I don't necessarily reject people's interest in obscure peoples or topics of history. The problem is that, we just don't know much about Stone Age Africa because there's just not much to go off of. I don't discourage people from studying that. And I think archaeology and anthropology are fascinating subjects. It's just that, unfortunately, in the midst of this sort of modern culture war, everything's been turned into a cultural battlefield. And I wish things were in a better atmosphere. But for the time being, I think people would be more well off with, sticking to, I don't want to call it traditional history, but, somewhere between, the great man narrative of history and, a quasi-social history of the world. I think, it's somewhere in the middle there, but, anyways, I'll end it there. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, thank you. Keith Preston.
Well, I think there are different paradigms that you can use to study history effectively. For instance, I don't think bottom-up history or social history is entirely wrong, but I think where some of these disciplines go wrong is when they start becoming exclusionary of other points of view, or they place an irrational or unreasonable emphasis on certain things over other things. And I think a lot of the social history approach does that. I mean, the idea is you want to compensate for things that were excluded in the past. Well, in the past, these people were excluded, these people were excluded, these events were excluded, and maybe they were, but then there's a such thing as overcompensation as well. There's an overreaction to that. And I think that a lot of the paradigm that's dominant today is that it's sort of an overreaction against the past. Well, whatever they did in the past, we have to do it differently now because because all of that was wrong. For instance, you get it's almost become, and this is true not just in history, but in a lot of other disciplines. in the humanities. There's this kind of like I said before, it's almost pathological, the sense of trying to reject whatever came before, or specializing in debunking what is considered to be the established narrative or received narrative. Where I know I had this one professor in graduate school that she was big on trying to debunk the claim that Patrick Henry gave his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. She believed that was not really history, that was just sort of an apocryphal story, and it may have been, but she thought this was like a really important thing. This idea, well, Patrick Henry didn't really say "Give me liberty, give me death," and I used to think, well, so what if he didn't? I mean, it's not like it's some profound document that's shaped history or whatever. I mean, it's not the Constitution, it's not the Declaration of Independence. It's just some guy talking in a church at one point. It was just his opinion. So what if he didn't say it? So what if war propagandists or biographers made it up? So what? It's just not that big of a deal. But I think that the fact that there's such an emphasis on that kind of thing is rooted in this idea that the purpose of scholarship is to debunk what they think the establishment narrative is. And the problem is they create an establishment narrative of their own. For example, if you in a lot of sociology departments, for example, or social sciences generally, if you were to say, well, you know what, I don't really think gender is a social construct. I think there's a certain essence to gender or race or something like that. Then it would be like being in a Catholic seminary saying you don't really believe in the Immaculate Conception or something. It's so they're creating their own set of dogmas or their own creeds or whatever, based on this sort of anti-creedal creed or whatever you'd want to call it.
All right, terminal philosophy. Or Swithun Dobson.
I'm now terminal. I would agree. I would agree with what Keith said, and there's definitely the element in his department. Well, it's general culture as such, that what we want to do is to debunk the past. We want to reinterpret the past, etc. One last thought I thought was possibly driving this way of going to really obscure parts of history where we don't really know anything about them because nothing has been written down, is related to the postmodern stuff. My impression of certain historians is an undue skepticism of historical documents. It's almost as if anything is written down historically, we must disbelieve it to be true. It must be just in their interests to write this down, and even recognizing it's just an interest. It therefore can have no bearing on reality at all in any way, shape, or form. I noticed this because my mum watched. You probably don't know if you traveled to the US. Ran for like 10 years or something. An archaeology program in England, a thing called Time Team, and at one point they were doing. This is a slightly different point, although it relates to the archaeology. Is there was a world expert on like medieval history of certain aspects. A guy called Mick Aston is now died. He was at Birmingham University, and he said, based on all the archaeology and his knowledge of the history and the written records and stuff, this should be dated to a certain time. And then they got the radiocarbon data and said it was like two or 300 years the wrong way. He was like, this is highly surprising. Otherwise known as, he probably thought this made no sense. But there seems to be a move towards focus away from written records to, we must do science in history and use all the tools of science, because otherwise this is going to get us the truth of the past, because we can't believe anything anybody ever wrote. Which to me just seems to be just an excuse to engage in even more speculative things, because how much can just a single radiocarbon date tell you? Well, not really that much, even if it's accurate, because you've got to contextualize this in the whole sort of tapestry of history and things. I've always thought that approach was just completely absurd. I mean, if you look at the accounts of like Herodotus, where does Herodotus tell the truth all the time? Was he even intending to say something that was sort of quote unquote scientific history? Well, probably not. Does that mean everything Herodotus said was false? No, of course it doesn't. But it's this very unnuanced approach whereby, oh, well, someone lied once, we must disbelieve everybody ever. In a way, it just seems to be a mark of a very, very bad upbringing, that your parents treated you badly, They lied to you, therefore everybody does. It's that kind of mentality, which I think really in general characterizes the SJW movement. I know that's a different topic. And I'm not saying the academic historians necessarily have such a personality. I don't want to be sued for slander. But it's within the similar sort of way of looking at things. So I thought that was an interesting note to end on.
All right. Well, thank you, Terminal Philosophy, Keith Preston, Swithun Dobson. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.